Hey everyone, welcome back here to English 111 at Delta College. This is week 6, and we are looking at revising and editing for this week. Now, as I've said before, each of the assignments in here will have a revising and editing lesson that's associated with it that builds on what came before. So previously we have talked about revision in general and revising introductions. This week we're going to focus on revising conclusions. And then for editing, we're going to look at sentence errors. Okay, so conclusions. What is a conclusion? This tends to confuse people because they've been given faulty information. They're told often that for your conclusion, you need to restate your thesis or to summarize your essay. So, if you tell them what you're going to tell them and then tell them it and then just tell them what you just told them. And that doesn't really work. That's appropriate for a public speaking situation where your audience doesn't have your text in front of you, or in front of them rather. You need that repetition and structure to reinforce what you're saying so that it's easier for your audience to remember. But in the case of a written situation, your audience has the text in front of them, so you don't need to repeat yourself or summarize what you just said. So a conclusion isn't a summation, or rather, it is a summation and not a summary. So if you think in terms of math, the sum of an equation is what the equation adds up to. So 1 plus 2 equals 3. And that's what we're dealing with here when it comes to writing. Your conclusion is the sum of the equation that you've just presented to your audience, to your reader. So you need to answer the question of so what? Why is it that the reader should care about what you just told them? How is it relevant to them? How does it affect their lives? So don't summarize what you just told your reader, but explain to them, here's what it means. Here's what it all adds up to. I've talked a little bit before about syllogisms, and syllogisms are the most basic form of argument in writing. And not just in writing, but just argumentation in general. And they're based on deductive reasoning, where you have a series of premises and then the conclusion logically follows from them. So the classic example is all humans are mortal. Socrates was human, therefore Socrates was mortal. So if 1, or x in this case, is true, and y is true, therefore z must be true as well. So you can come up with a valid reasoning based on the information that you presented. So if it's valid, then your conclusion logically follows from your premises or from the information that you've presented. And in order to test for validity, you can work backwards and solve for x. So if we know that the conclusion is Socrates was mortal, and we know that Socrates was human, therefore we can extrapolate from that and infer that all humans are mortal. So if we have the conclusion, we should be able to work backwards to find out what the missing evidence is. So your conclusion, again, sums up your argument. It sums up your paper. It doesn't summarize it. It reaches the next step. It reaches the conclusion of adding up to here's what it all means. And for an example, I've taken this conclusion from the textbook, which I've been referencing all semester, How to Write Anything. This is a student essay from Jordan Brown called A Word from My Antiphone Soapbox. This is just the conclusion. But by reading the conclusion, we can figure out what this paper was all about. What was the subject? What was the topic and thesis? To make that a little bit easier, I've highlighted certain phrases here, which helps to illustrate the subject of the topic. But before we get into this, I want you to note that there's 2 paragraphs here. Just like an introduction, a conclusion does not have to be limited to just 1 paragraph. Think of it in terms of sections, an introductory section and a conclusion section. So you don't have to limit yourself to one paragraph. And note that this does not begin by saying in conclusion or to conclude. If you have to tell your reader that you are concluding now, then you're not doing a very good job of concluding, because they should be able to tell from the information that you presented that you're reaching your conclusion. Don't tell them, by the way, here's my conclusion. So, earth to you, the people who never part from their cell phones. I'm sure you've taken several breaks while reading this rant to check your email and respond to a few texts. You probably missed most of the points of my argument too, much like you're missing what's going on in the world around you. Cell phones were initially meant to connect us, broadening the time frame during which people could communicate with one another. But with all the new apps being incorporated into these devices, isolation only grows, shrinking your world and perspective. You're all constantly talking and thinking about how you feel and what you think. You don't talk to Rachel or Steven, but to the Twitterverse or to Facebook at large. You communicate without any idea of who's really listening. So we know right away that this has something to do with cell phones and the ways that cell phones, which ironically were meant to connect people through communication, is isolating them. So that's the subject and the topic here. So what? What does it add up to? Why should people know or care about this? 12 people preferred phone activities to talking to each other, and me over 3-tiered red velvet cheesecake. Seriously, people, put those phones down. You're not thinking clearly. So that's the point that the writer here really wants the reader to get. You need to put your phones down. Why? Because you're just isolating yourself from the rest of the world. Okay, so you can see the way a conclusion works. It's the next step in the information that you've presented. You're not summarizing what you just said, but you're saying, here's what it means. Here's why you should know about this. Here's why you should care. So what? And so we come to editing. Previously, we talked about punctuation and word errors, which are the two smallest units of meaning in writing. Now we're putting them together into sentences, and we're going to look at some common sentence errors, which are fragments, fused sentences, which includes comma splices, faulty parallelism, and passive voice. Okay, so a quick review. What is a sentence? A sentence has three parts: the subject, the verb, and the object, or the actor, the action, and that which receives the action. Now, if a sentence has those three parts, we call that an independent clause or a simple sentence. So, for example, my experience as a camp counselor has taught me many lessons. That's a simple sentence because it consists of a single subject, verb, and object. The subject in this case is my experience as a camp counselor. The verb is taught. And what's the object? Me. Many lessons have been taught to me by my experience as a camp counselor. So that's a simple sentence in that it consists of a single independent clause. Now, you can create complex sentences by adding dependent clauses to your independent clause. So a complex sentence is a combination of an independent clause with a dependent one. And then a compound sentence is when you have more than one independent clauses that have been combined. Okay, so fragments are dependent clauses. They're missing one of the elements of the sentence, at least the subject, verb, and or object. So for example, the kind of lessons I cannot easily put into words. That's not a complete thought. It's not a complete sentence. It cannot stand on its own. So it's a fragment or a dependent clause. And how do we fix fragments? With punctuation, usually. Now, if you recall, when we talked about the rules of grammatical punctuation, we said that commas are used to attach dependent clauses to independent ones to create complex sentences. So that's the easiest way to fix a fragment, is to combine it with the preceding or following sentence, because that's usually where the missing element is. My experience as a counselor has taught me many lessons, the kind of lessons that cannot easily put into words. There you go. That's the easiest way to fix a fragment, is to combine it with the preceding or following sentence with a comma. You could also use what's called a conjunction. Conjunctions are connecting words like and, but, and or. And if you review conjunction, junction, what's your function, that will help you remember it. But you could use the comma instead, because that's what commas are used for. In either case, the way to fix a fragment is to identify what's missing and then supply the missing element. As I said, it's usually in the preceding or following sentence. So the easiest way to fix a fragment is just to combine them. And then the opposite direction is the fused sentence, or what used to be called the run-on sentence. So a fused sentence is when you have a series of independent clauses that have been combined without the proper combining element. And that includes comma splices. Comma splices are where people put commas where the fusion occurs in the sentence. And we know that that's incorrect, because you only use commas for attaching dependent clauses to independent ones. You don't use them when attaching independent clauses together. So, for example, expanding the airport will generate more flights. More flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. That's the simple fused sentence, and that you have two independent clauses that have been combined without something to combine them. Expanding the airport will generate more flights, comma, more flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. That's the comma splice, because you're putting the comma there to attach the two independent clauses. And again, that's not correct. So there are three ways to fix fused sentences. You can separate the clauses with a period. Expanding the airport will generate more flights. More flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. That would work. A better way would be to use the semicolon, because that creates a sense of balance to the sentence. And again, semicolons, the rule for those is that you use them to create compound sentences by combining a series of independent clauses. Expanding the airport will generate more flights. More flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. Personally, I like that because it gives a sense of balance. The second clause naturally completes the thought of the first one, and you're not using more words than you need. But another way you could fix it is with a conjunction. So in this case, you could say and. Expanding the airport will generate more flights, and more flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. That works too. Personally, I prefer using the semicolon because, like I said, with the conjunction, you're using that extra word, which you don't really need. So if you use the semicolon, you can be more concise. But either of those options will work just as well. Faulty parallelism. This is really tricky. So if something is parallel, then that means that it's running, you have lines that are running in the same direction. Faulty parallelism is when your lines are not running in the same direction. How does that apply to sentence structure? Well, same basic concept. If you have a certain pattern of sentences that you're using, and then you break that pattern, you create faulty parallelism. So, for example, as the temperature dropped, we moved our bedrolls closer to the fire, hung blankets over the windows, and more logs were added to the blaze. So in this case, we're shifting the order of the words or the elements of the sentence, going from what should be subject, verb, object, and we're in the second part of that sentence, it's shifting the subjects and objects around. But also there's a shift in the verbs, because we're using past tense verbs which end in ed, and we're breaking that pattern. So to fix that, you need to identify what your pattern is. As the temperature dropped, that tells us that the pattern is subject before verb, with verbs in past tense ending with ed. So that's the pattern we have to follow. As the temperature dropped, we moved our bedrolls closer to the fire, hanged blankets over the windows, and added more logs to the blaze. Now, hanged, or to hang rather, is one of those irregular verbs, and that it has two past tense forms, one of which is active and the other is passive. So hanged is active past tense. Hung is passive past tense. So blankets were hung over the windows would make it passive. But because the pattern we've established is what we call active, and I'll discuss that in a minute here, we need to use the active form of the verb. Okay, and finally, passive voice. So again, a sentence consists of a subject, a verb, and an object. And if you put the subject before the verb, then that's called active voice because you're focusing on the actor of the sentence by putting that first. Passive voice is the opposite. This is when you put the object before the verb. So we are all affected by pesticides, for example. That is passive because the verb is affected. Well, what is doing the affecting? Pesticides. Well, who is being affected? All of us. So by putting the object first, we're making that passive voice. We are all affected by pesticides. If you wanted to make that active, you would just flip it around and say pesticides affect us all. Now, here's the thing. Passive voice is grammatically correct. And there are some situations where you will be required to use passive voice. Generally speaking, though, active voice is preferable because it sounds more natural, first of all. We tend to speak in active voice, and the English language is sort of naturally active. Passive voice often sounds odd. So if you take the classic rock Stairway to Heaven, the line is she's buying a stairway to heaven. That's active voice. In passive, it would be a stairway to heaven is being bought by her, which sounds really weird. It's grammatically correct. It just doesn't sound right. And also, when you use passive voice like that, notice that you end up using more words. So it's less concise than active voice would be. So generally speaking, active voice is preferable, certainly in English classes. We prefer active voice. But like I said, there are some situations and some subjects that require the use of passive voice. And these tend to be subjects that deal with laboratory reports or lab work. So the physical sciences, healthcare, physics, chemistry, those sorts of subjects that require, or rather that focus on lab work and observation, those require the use of passive voice because there is a sense of objectivity, literally objectivity, because you're focusing on the object of the sentence by putting that before the verb. So you have to be able to identify what is appropriate within the given situation and be able to sort of navigate between the two. And that can be tricky. It takes practice. It kind of breaks the brain a little bit in that you kind of have to force yourself to think backwards. But the important thing is to be consistent. Whether you're using active or passive voice, be consistent. Choose one and stick with it. And in the case of English, for an English class and most academic writing, stick with active voice. Okay, so that's it for this week. As with the previous lessons on revision and editing, you are now responsible for that information and those skills. So I am incorporating sentence errors into the grading of your papers, along with the punctuation and word errors. So I'm taking that into consideration. And also, I expect you to write conclusions that are appropriate and sophisticated, that you're not just summarizing your papers, but rather you're taking that next step and explaining why it's important to the reader, why they should know whatever it is you just told them. Okay, and then the final draft for this assignment, we're very nearly done with the course. The final draft is due at the end of this week. Okay, that's it for this week. Next week, we will start the final assignment, which is the literary analysis. We're very close to being finished here, so try to relax and have fun with it. Okay, as always, take it easy, take care, and be excellent to each other.